Reported this morning that the BBC is set to confront challenges regarding the TV licence fee in the coming weeks as ministers initiate a fundamental review of the broadcaster following bias allegations.
So, is the broadcaster still fit for purpose? Well, let's speak to Cath Leng, who's the former chief writer for the BBC News. Cath, good morning. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on the show. Now, you've been interviewed in the last couple of days for The Times and I think other newspapers about what led to your departure from the BBC. Can you tell our viewers what happened?
Well, it started about 8 years ago. I realised there was something wrong with the way the BBC was reporting the sex and gender issue, and I started pitching stories and seeking meetings with editors, trying to work to change the language. I spoke to so many different editors and programme makers and emailed dozens of them across politics, health, education, even sport. I know nothing about sport. I'm not interested in sport, but I would make representations to sport to say, can you cover this story? As you say, there's a little bit in the Telegraph about some of the work I did on that, but you know, none of it really got anywhere. And I feel like what Tim Davies said, I think he's right to be proud of his journalists. I think a lot of journalists were actually let down by management. There's a body of journalists doing very good work, but some of us were just used as human shields. We raised these difficult issues, nothing was done, and still now they're denying that institutional bias exists on this particular issue. This is the one that we're interested in, specifically sex and gender. Very little has changed.
I mean, it does sound like it really was institutional because, as you say, it wasn't just one department, it was across lots of departments, and it seems to be happening at every single layer of hierarchy within the BBC. What do you think is going on? Do you think it's a problem with the way that journalists were trained not to understand the importance of due impartiality within the BBC? Or is it a question, perhaps, of the BBC only hiring people from one kind of thought background, if you like, and not really prioritising diversity of thought?
I think there was a problem when there were two identity correspondents appointed back in 2018, and they were definitely on the gender belief side of things. No, I think this is really a definition of, it could be a definition of institutional bias, because there are plenty of people in the BBC who are questioning and curious about this issue and would like to do more work on it. But the BBC, you can't. I mean, it's built into the framing of the way it's covered. So even if you do cover a story like this, you are forced to cover it within the framing of preferred pronouns. You have to acknowledge, you can't question the existence of gender identity. You can't cover it in a truly investigative way. So that's what I would call institutional bias. It's built it's carved into the walls of BBC journalism on this issue. So there are people who would like to do more work on it, and there were people who did work on it. For example, when you look at the fantastic work on the Tavistock by Deb Cohen and Hannah Barnes, and Esme Wren, the editor there. That was a wonderful piece of work, but it wasn't picked up anywhere else in the BBC because of resistance. So when we were pitching our different stories, it wasn't just me, there were others as well. When we were pitching our different stories, the existence of this unit, the identity unit, meant that all those other hubs, health, education and sport, they would bat it off. I was actually sent to the identity unit with my sports stories. I couldn't believe that sport wasn't interested. And they would be considered the experts on it, so they would be the ones to cover the story. Of course, they never did cover the story because it was always very, very affirmative. The people that worked there had a very affirmative view. And the main problem is that if you look at the story about gender identity, it's a story about facts, and the problem is that the fact of sex and biological sex was always treated and is still treated as an opinion. So you have people try to balance it, and they say you have to balance this idea that there are two biological sexes. You have to balance it with the other view. And these aren't balancing views. It's not two equal opinions. We've got a set of facts, and we should be telling the audience about them.
Now, critics of some of the stories that have come out in the past few days have said, well, all news organisations are biased, everybody has a point of view. But Do you think that the BBC is in a particularly special, privileged position because, firstly, they do have such an enormous audience, but secondly, because they are paid for essentially through taxation or by the licence fee, they have a duty to represent all viewpoints? Do you think that the BBC has actually had undue influence over this debate on sex and gender?
Yes, it has had undue influence, and it's true to say, even today, people think if it's not on the BBC, it isn't true, or it isn't happening. But you're also right to say all outlets have this affirmative bias. I think GB News doesn't have the same affirmative bias. Like, you can look at stories that are outside that framing of affirmation, but the BBC. It's not. It is its public remit that makes it so important. But it is based on very sound principles. The BBC, the principles of accuracy, educate, inform, reflect a broad perspective across the UK. All those principles are completely sound and remain sound. The problem is that on this particular issue, they've strayed from those principles, and to get it right, all they have to do is return to those principles. So personally, I'm not a defunder. And I think it's foolish to say that because the BBC doesn't do what I want, it doesn't say what I want it to say on this issue, it doesn't report the way I want it to report. I think it's foolish to say, therefore, we should defund the BBC because of this specific issue, because they could turn it around tomorrow. For example, if they did turn it around tomorrow and they restored accuracy and they stopped using preferred pronouns, that would have a global impact. It would ripple across the world. And I think it's one of the reasons they don't do it. It's one of the reasons why complaints activism on this issue is so virulent. It is very, very difficult for the BBC to deal with the level of complaints. I know that GB News has a problem with complaints activism as well. But, I mean, when Martin Croxall did her little thing on the news saying pregnant women instead of pregnant people, it's just an accurate thing to say. Initially, there were nearly 500 complaints about that. That is like extraordinary, and a couple of dozen of them were so and those, even the BBC did well there. The first time they got these complaints, they said we're not having it, it's fine. But 20 of them went through, about 2 dozen of them went through all the way to the Executive Complaints Unit, and that's where they got this sort of rather flawed judgment where it was upheld. But that's the scale of what they're dealing with, complaints activism. So every time you do story about it, the editors and the presenters are always thinking about the level of complaint they're going to get, because the complaints unit is not empowered to just bat those complaints off. They go back to the journalists, and the journalists have to deal with them personally. It takes a lot of work and time to do that, and it puts them off doing the story.
Oh, well, thank you so much for speaking to us, Cath. That gives us such an interesting perspective on what's been going on. This idea of a very small but very, very vocal minority being able to essentially dictate the BBC's editorial position. Extraordinary.
Complaints activism. I think that's a fantastic phrase. And you can see the BBC's position. If Martin Croxall just raising her eyebrows generated 500 complaints, all of which they had to deal with, you can see why they're put off being a bit braver.
Complaints activism. She's
I've written it down. I like that. I'm going to use it. It's a very good description of what was going on. Well, in response to this, the BBC said, we do not comment on individual staff members or former staff members. All news staff are required to comply with the BBC's social media guidelines, and we take the appropriate action when these are breached.
The chairman of the BBC, Samir Shah, said this yesterday. Since the publication of Mr Prescott's memo, this issue has led to over 500 complaints. These are now being dealt with in the normal way. It has also prompted further reflection by the BBC. The conclusion of that deliberation is that we accept that the way the speech was edited did give the impression of a direct call for violent action. The BBC would like to apologise for this error of judgment.
I think the agenda issue is so important where the BBC are concerned, because it's not just about their broadcast, it's about the materials that are put out in schools and used by schools that have had such a big impact on children as well.
Absolutely, and I'm fascinated by 500 complaints about that Donald Trump speech being edited, 500 complaints as well about Martin Croxall rolling her eyes. That just shows the type of people who are writing in to the BBC.
Don't write into us. We won't make you complain this morning.